Thanks. I have to say, like, microphones make me like slightly nervous. So let me know if the sound is okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. I like to unfold this conversation as a series of questions, quite directly, to Tony, thinking mainly about the Evil series, which is shown downstairs, and it was shown recently at the Berlin Biennale and in a show at Green Naftali in New York. Looking through those questions, broader themes in Tony Cook's practice. And I'd like this conversation to be more or less like very informal, like a studio visit. So thinking on very simple questions to then unfold broader topics. I would afterwards focus on, as you said already, on the recent collaboration that me and Tony had in Vienna for a show called Could You Visit Me in Dreams, which originated a 3-channel installation and a book. And then I will leave that out to you for questions directly to Tony as well. We will be showing images and extract of the Vienna work. So the first question is quite directly related to your creative process, as the Evil videos often feature monochromatic text-laden slides set to music, distributing the heterogeneous information that use samples to expose popular rhetorics of power. I'm interested in understanding what comes first. Do you gather the text, then there is the music, or is like an intuitive process that puts together these elements?
Yeah, it's. I think I began a procedure for the Evil works in particular of just gathering. I tend to work between kind of anecdotal, journalistic modes and theoretical modes when I'm thinking about possible material. But like, yeah, the first layer is just gathering texts. I kind of have a very unkempt, unorganized series of things. So it's kind of like things on the fly, things that catch my attention. And then later, maybe I'll go back and comb through it with a specific idea, perhaps in mind. Sometimes I combine 2 or 3 texts to kind of create a kind of frisson or imagined relationships between them. Sometimes I like to concentrate on a single text. Sometimes I will also have like themes, specific themes in mind. I mean, maybe I should talk specifically about one work, like Torture Music, which this is a still from. I saw a number of articles in newspapers and magazine contexts about the subject of the use of popular music and other sound forms in so-called enhanced interrogation, which is actually torture. And I thought, well, okay, this is a kind of vernacular, a kind of public modality of rhetoric around this subject. And I also knew that there was a kind of developing corpus of research and scholarship on the same or related topics. And so I started by kind of collecting and noting some of the newspaper magazine articles. And then I happened to be a visiting scholar at the Getty Research Institute, and I actually had someone who could actually pull articles. And so I said, well, let me look at the scholarly literature on this topic. And strangely enough, my tendency would be to take like anecdotal incidents and maybe combine them with texts that spoke to the broader implications or histories of this material. And in the research that was prepared for me, there happened to be this article from The Nation where the writer basically did that sort of collaging work in a way in the form of the piece already. And so it seemed like at that point, it was just a kind of question of editing it, right?
Yeah.
And that was the visual aspect. From the production side, though, usually the first thing that I commit to is the soundtrack. And sometimes I go in with ideas about how it's going to function. Sometimes I discover it like through the process. In the case of Evil 16 Torture Music, it was more kind of the idea of the playlist and excerpts from things that had been cited both in, mostly in the popular, in the newspaper articles, but to some extent, these citations were also part of the more scholarly aspect of things. And so it was kind of a matter of, deciding on a strategy. And usually the first thing that I actually commit to think about relationships with the text is the sound. And I decided, oh yeah, I don't want, I want there to be a kind of relationship as you move through the piece that maybe changes. So it starts off with very short segments from a variety of musical texts. And as you get deeper into the piece, the excerpts sort of get longer. And in one case, I actually cite an entire track from beginning to end, but that's not the overall strategy. And I was kind of thinking about it as, there's a kind of regularity in the presentation of the text. And I thought it might be interesting to contrast that with, starting off with small clips and then gradually sort of getting longer
Like
and longer.
expanding.
Yeah. So that's kind of a sense of,
Yeah.
how projects might work. Yeah, so I kind of, collect things, put them in a bin, and then go back, with maybe more specific intent. And then, decide whether I'm going to collage text or whether I'm going to take a single, article and, intervene and edit within that constraint. My approach to music is actually similar sometimes. Like, sometimes I'm interested in kind of almost the arc and you could say imprint of the music itself as a kind of container that can be juxtaposed with and perhaps provide a context for, disparate shards of text. So sometimes I take the opposite approach. It's almost like it's a challenge to kind of have a single song or a group of songs kind of uninterrupted, unedited. And for me, I think it's kind of parallel to the normative aspect of image editing and montage.
Yeah.
And that was something I was really attentive to when I was making pieces. And when occasionally I do still make pieces that have reworkings, recalibrations of found imagery. And so it was kind of almost like a structural idea, that there's editing and a kind of production and post-production process that goes into the making of the sound. So when people say, well, where is the montage? And it's sort of like the montage and the layering is kind of in the soundtracks and maybe the relationship between these very simple text animations and
The sound.
the accompanying sound.
Well, the first time I saw your work, my experience of it gave me two deep effects. The first one was like making me feel extremely awake, as suddenly realizing the impact that the context we are when we receive certain kind of information has on our experience of it. And the other feeling was being dazed, as confused, because this idea of sampling information and text and having a chromatic field plus having the sound, which has an extreme affective power, also related to your personal memories, because often pop music has within an affective power of things that we remember of, made me completely drift away. And the third reaction was actually smirking, because I kept smiling once I was understanding where the actual information was coming from, because that's also the surprising part, that you read new things and you have a new reaction towards them, like looking at them for the first time.
It's kind of an effect of, you could say, decontextualization of things and then recontextualizing them maybe in a kind of unexpected way. I mean, I often use citation, but very rarely do I disclose sources at the beginning of the piece. It's kind of like something that you might intuit as you're sort of experiencing the material. And then, of course, I always kind of, or almost always, give specific citations of the sources of the material at the end, because I don't want it to be a mystery in a kind of absolute sense, but I do like the idea of things being displaced, if only temporarily, and thinking about, you know, what are the kind of possibilities and consequences for reading and for thinking, of taking a moment to try to process even sometimes very familiar materials in a different way and in a different sort of context, and temporally, and maybe, again, as sometimes I tend to go back and forth sometimes between, this kind of is the way that I approach things maybe in general. Sometimes I will take a specific incident or a specific text and edit that almost to give a kind of like case study of a particular moment. And other times I will take bits and pieces of a kind of trajectory, a historical kind of thing. And sometimes I even notate, you know, where this particular thing came from in time, again, to create a kind of case study, but also slices through time, as opposed to all from one source. And I kind of go back and forth between those strategies.
That's also why the Evil series doesn't have a progressive numeric listing.
Yeah, because again, it's maybe in some ways a kind of reflection on, you know, the process by which this material has been gathered and sort of recontextualized and reconsidered. I kind of like the idea of systems, and I use them kind of on a regular basis, and yet there's something idiosyncratic too. You know, I want maybe contingency or desire or to play a part in the process and to kind of foreground that, as opposed to, I began here, I did step one, I did step two, I did step three. It's more kind of projective, more speculative in a certain way, that I want the things to be porous, maybe open to revision in some ways, because I like plans, I do, and I kind of like plan rigorously, but I also know and expect that things get really interesting when you realize that it's partial, or that there are inconsistencies or breakages. The idea of kind of making things linear, it may not be kind of what my model of history or historiography would be. You know, that it's kind of fragmented often, especially now, it seems. Yeah. And so the idea is that, you know, people sometimes ask me, when will it end, you know, the Evil series? And, you know, I sort of go, unfortunately, I don't know. Yeah,
maybe
it's sort
never.
of like, doesn't seem to be ending. And it's also interesting, you know, I started out thinking that it was something that was kind of going to be based in a particular contemporary moment and its aftermath. But very early on, I would occasionally look backwards into history, kind of for maybe related moments, at least in my mind, in the prehistory, you know, of the War on Terror. Like I find certain synchronicities or differences too, say, between the way terror as a kind of object and concept is wielded rhetorically, to the way fear of, you know, communism in the Cold War
was portrayed,
was figured. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, on the one hand, you know, a kind of specific history, and then also echoes, you know, in terms of rhetorics or in terms of stylizations of images and representations, and how those two, you know, have kind of echoes of other things. Sometimes at, you know, great geographical or cultural distances, which is another, you know, a kind of phenomenon that interests me, maybe in general. One of the reasons why I'm drawn to popular music, its circulations, its, you know, kind of economies, its relationships to identity, place and space, and how those things get scrambled, often.
I guess that once you decontextualize all these elements, you allow themselves to be abstract elements. So you can connect the dots and see repetition or how different key points link up across geographies or historical moments. I want to go back to the color and the war on terror, because in the work Evil 12, you speak directly about color and the way it has been used to indicate fear or alert moments within American society and to exercise political power. I'd like to know more about your use of color as a feature within your work, but also as a feature within the architectural spaces that you construct.
Okay, that's kind of a two-parter.
Yes.
Initially, I think there's a kind of somewhere between the perverse and the generic impulse, I think, in my work and its forms. To step away from color for a second, I think the idea of presenting text in particular forms and formats has kind of relationships both to advertising modes of presentation, interpolation of subjects, ideas about point of view, and ideas about who is the intended audience for a given, utterance in, public and or private even, pronouncements. So there's that. And then there's kind of maybe a competing notion in relation, say, from structuralist film, where, you could make films about kind of conditions of reception and production of film. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take those modalities of address and reform them in some way? And I think, obviously there are historical examples maybe that I'm responding to, and I'm hoping to, do those things differently or in a combination that is unexpected in a way. So that's kind of, and it's sort of like in terms of most of the things in the Evil series use kind of variations on red, white, and blue, which have, kind of obvious and plain relationships to colors of flags. But of course, it could be the US flag, and in some instances and contexts, it could be the British flag. And I'm also interested in those kinds of like perverse relationships between nationalisms and who they belong to, and maybe questioning, those kinds of relations. Just anecdotally, there are some works that kind of hope to complicate, that relation. It's in some ways like Evil 16, Torture Music, is also a good example there, because it's often music is sort of framed as American music, but as often as not, it's also British music from, the same period. And so it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? It's like, it's on the one hand, it's an imperial sort of mode of address used in these, kind of horrific contexts. In another sense, it's also a little bit confused about this kind of nationalism that it's meant to promulgate, And so I find those kinds of gaps in aporia, kind of interesting.
Thanks. I think I'm also interested in the idea of non-visibility, and in particular, like you externalize it throughout many different works, but that was the title of your show, Green Naftali, but as well in the work Evil 27, you put forward the idea that deeper transformation are not supported by many images, but imagination. And you question that maybe images slow down transformation. I'd like you to unfold a bit on this idea.
Yeah, I think there's something somewhat counterintuitive about the argument. And it's also maybe an opportunity to kind of talk in a different way about like what my work is or what its process is. And so this may seem to be an aside, but I think it's connected. Non-visibility as a concept came to me in a couple of different ways. I think the thing that attracted me to the text that I use in this particular work was precisely its uncanny quality. That as I was reading it, it's a text that was composed by this group called Our Literal Speed. I won't try to describe them. They are kind of, you could say, an experiment in kind of the physical, the performative aspects of scholarship and theoretical endeavor. That might be a good sort of thumbnail pieces of what they do and how they do. And they both write texts, they sometimes stage events. I've been peripherally involved in some of the events. And certain issues get framed by their practice that always are of some kind of compelling interest to me. And I remember when reading this particular text, and some people have even remarked on it, it's sort of like, it seems to be an argument to consider the possibilities of thinking through not the image, but kind of the imagined relationship to the image. And is it possible to kind of defer the image, or some have even argued refuse the image, in order to maybe talk about it in a different manner or context? And I realized kind of while reading it that that could be a description of aspects of what my practice seeks to do. And kind of like kind of like being reminded of something. It's like, oh yeah, I used to actually work on, very specific repertoires of images and try, to construct a kind of counter memory or counter argument, looking at the gaps and insufficiencies of, the available imagery in a, say, archival setting, those limitations. And it's sort of like I took on a different set of limitations after 9/11. And I sort of wondered about it while I was doing it. Could I do it? Because in some ways it was sort of like, well, is this, a kind of refusal of a kind of encounter that, quote unquote, needs to happen? And while reading the text, I realized that, oh, well, maybe not having the image present has a kind of useful function, especially, in a cultural context and a political context where we seem to be inundated by imagery of various kinds and processes of various kinds. There may be a desire to reframe, and possibilities for reading might be a useful strategy. It's like I kind of greatly admire people who wish to work through the image, and occasionally I've even borrowed or recruited materials from people who are, interested in that kind of activity. But it was almost like I'm interested in talking about those things maybe in a different register.
Yeah. And also somehow what happens to political power and political position once you delete the image. Because in this particular work, you state that once there's no image, you can't claim something happened or something was true or something happened in this specific way. So it's also the famous fake news phenomena that is characterizing our current moment, that is mainly given by images that are not we can't state their truthfulness besides the value of the image itself. So the event exists within the image, but suddenly what happens once you delete that part?
Yeah.
And I find it somehow extremely important because you give an alternative to look at things, or suggest an alternative to look at things in a different way, by deleting these images.
Yeah, and thinking about the possibility that it might be true without an image.
Yeah.
That there's no specific image, and that sometimes you enter into a kind of mode of sociality or cultural practice or political practice without necessarily knowing what the outcomes will be. And that to the extent that you know in advance what the outcomes will be, that may actually be a problem, rather than a solution or,
I think more or less this is it for the first part.
Okay.
I'd like to invite you all, if you haven't seen, to go downstairs and see the show, which there's a lot of the works that we just talked about on different levels. And I guess, we can speak about it later when your questions. We would like now to show you the first channel of the work we did together in Vienna. So the video is titled as the show, Could You Visit Me in Dreams? But I'd like to give a brief introduction about it. So the show was part of Curated By, which is a curatorial festival that happens every year in Vienna, which I was invited to participate. And this year the topic was Vienna. And as I was terrified about the idea of doing a show about a city, which wasn't my city in any sense, or also giving a sort of urbanistic or nationalistic idea, I decided to pass the agency to someone else and invite Tony at the beginning to write a text which could construct the base of the show. The invitation was sent. Tony was enthusiastic and was fantastic. This is something I really want to work on. I haven't been in Vienna for the last 20 years. Doesn't matter. Give me some time. The output was fantastic because Tony came back with a 15 pages text, which now is also a book that you can see here as the Vienna Guide.
Mostly constructed and quoted from other sources.
Exactly. So we started thinking, we can unfold it after looking at the work, but I started thinking at Vienna, what do you gather of a place before you actually go there? What information you can find? How do you collide different sources from an historical point of view to club night descriptions to elements of contemporaneity that were happening whilst he was making the work, to pieces of writing that talk a bit about the non-visibility concept that he also put together in a previous moment. And you'll see also through the film that is something extremely fluid that allows you to give a gaze that is distant but at the same time extremely present. So it's also about this idea of how information travels from a geographical distance and how do you appropriate a presence within a location without visiting it. Okay.
Come in, man. What will I do without you? Don't know what I do without you. What will I do without you? Don't know what I do without you. What will I do without you? Don't know what I do without you. What will I do without you? Don't know what I do without you. All that I know is I'm falling, 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 falling.
Cold hands, warm heart, big dreams, false starts. Those pills don't work, they just make it work. Don't say you're through, I'll swim beside you. So this town, this sea, it won't drag you underneath. You gotta know that this will turn around. Until then, I will not let you down. When you find your ship is run aground, you can call me, I won't let you down. I won't let you down. This will turn around. Sick days, drunk nights, short fuse, loud fights, lose weight, all bones, white drugs, the undertow. Don't say you're done, 'cause you're brave and you're loved in this town, this sea. It won't drag you underneath. You gotta know that this will turn around. Until then, I will not let you down. When you find your ship is run aground, you can call me, I won't let you down. I won't let you down. This will turn around. I won't let you down. I won't let you down. You gotta know that this will turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around,
So I think it was important to show the entirety of the work as it assumes a bit of the elements that we've been talking about until now. One of the most interesting parts, these are like images of the exhibition, is that the work took shape and formalized into so many different levels and different formats. As we already said, it started as a text, but then it became a 3-channel installation,
Yeah.
and each channel had a different color and format, and then was used as a press release text or like as an exhibition text, an extract of it, and then the entirety of the text became a book, and the book contains 3 stickers,
Yeah, it's
which you can like get and stick around. In a sense, is like how I'm interested in discussing with you what happens to the same material once it's translated across so many different formats.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in those kinds of relationships because they do kind of inform at least the process of the kind of work that I do. And so I'm trying to figure out like modalities for having those two things in conversation with one another. It seems that it's not adequate to have it all be translated one way into a work of art. It's kind of interesting to then retranslate that material into other forms and formats, sometimes generic ones and sometimes also unexpected ones, you know, that they kind of go back and forth in the same way that when I'm reading, processing, listening to material, it gets, you know, iterated and transformed or versioned. Maybe it's part of my interest and preoccupation with sonic forms like the remix or the version. The idea that material can be articulated in multiple ways, multiple contexts, have multiple scales, and those possibilities really interest me. Lately, I've been doing works that kind of take the content of the videos that I've made and translate them back into print forms or textual forms. And so it's kind of a way of maybe thinking more comprehensively about mediums and their relationships and their sort of overlapping history. In the same way that, say, I might use techniques from 60s structural film or advertising in a different content or context than they originally occurred. So.
Amazing. I think, I mean, there's many more elements that we could talk about, but I might don't want to stretch it too long for the audience because they might have like questions to bring forward. And we wanted to read a little extract of the Vienna Guide.
Yeah, I'll read a little excerpt. It's interesting too, you know, for me in terms of maybe making experiences and or, you know, objects or media works. It's like I don't want things necessarily to be totally congruent, or questions of order and readability or understanding are things that are always kind of tense and complicated for me. So it was interesting to kind of develop the text in one sort of articulation, and then when doing the videos to kind of take it in a different order or in a different. So I'm going to read some things from the beginning of the book that don't figure in the first instance of the presentation you see when you see the exhibition installation. So, and I'm wondering, will you be the timekeeper?
Yes, I would say 10 minutes.
I'll see.
Okay.
Because I actually have a kind of desired passage that I'd like to read, and so maybe I'll pick where to start.
Fantastic. Okay.
And where to stop.
I'll be saying ding, but then you can.
The Vienna Guide. In Greek, the truth versus the visible. I'm staring at the asphalt wondering what's buried underneath, where I am, where I am. Wear my badge, a vinyl sticker with big block letters. Adhere it to my chest. Tells your new friends, I am a visitor here. I am not permanent. Seems so out of context in this gaudy apartment complex. The stranger with the door key explaining that I'm just visiting. Club 9. OC is a nice alternative to all other Viennese nightclubs. Situated in the first district, it features a relatively small area housing a bar as well as a dance floor. But it also offers a lounge area where you can refuel your powers after dancing for too long and bathing in other people's sweat. Music. At OC, you'll find great local DJs dishing unique electronic beats, as well as international guest DJs focused on house, techno house, minimal, and techno. What kind of night will you have? At OC, you will be sucked in by the atmosphere, the music, and the people enjoying themselves. The drinks are good and well priced. The location is practical, and the parties are often a bit weird and wonky. German as a second language at the Institute for German Philology at the University of Vienna. The department German as a second language at the Institute for German Philology at the University of Vienna addresses the question of how the disadvantages for multilingual children, young people, and adults resulting from the dominance of German as the official language can be reduced. It examines the range of different living, educational, and working areas, developing and evaluating models for the acquisition of the German language. In order to evaluate the links between language and its cultural and social framework, further scientific perspectives are employed, e.g., a critique of racism. Modern Vienna. 2 decades of struggle between the left and right political parties followed World War I, ending with the union of Austria with Germany, the Anschluss, in 1938. After World War II, Vienna was split among the Allies until 1955, when Austria regained its independence. Club 1. EG is situated inside an old electrical shop in a passage courtyard on Mariahilferstrasse. It was founded by architects and is not only a nightclub, but also a space for exhibitions, art, and video installations. It works well for both slow weekday evenings or long weekend club nights, filled with electronic music and good drinks. The division into a bar area, a lounge for having good conversations, a dance floor, and a courtyard out front makes it very convenient to switch places depending on your mood. Music. There's a daily DJ line with monthly resident clubs and occasional live concerts with focus on electronic music such as techno, electronica, house, wave, and hip hop. The club also features classical jazz, experimental, and avant-garde music, mostly on Sundays. What kind of night will you have? Depending on what you're looking for and what day of the week it is, you will either find yourself on the dance floor, standing at the bar, chatting up some strangers, or sitting outside in the courtyard while having a smoke, or getting some fresh air for your sweaty armpits. Sometime in the early 1980s, G began keeping a notebook to assist him in his search for ways of going on. He had recently experienced a mental break, moved from London back to his childhood home in Vienna, and become disillusioned with his band's DIY rough-hewn approach to their early singles. Fittingly, the independent label Rough Trade released these records, while mass-market Virgin will take over for Cupid. G needed to find, as he would later sing, a new hermeneutic, a new paradigm. Like nearly every other white musician before him, G found inspiration in black pop music, observing in his notebook that it was interesting to see how the ontology of function, utility, signification, and meaning was thrown into a minor crisis by rhythm. Its topical use as a jamming phenomenon is considerable. Rhythm and blues as philosophically motivated strategy, a pawn in the game of deconstruction. Fittingly, on Woodbee's Pray Like AF, 1984, an exquisitely crafted chanson about the ontological possibility of succeeding as a pop star that masquerades as a straightforward love song. The narrator admits that each time he goes to bed, he prays like AF. Instead of praying to the Queen of Soul, he imitates her, miming everything that he is not, black, a woman, an American, in an attempt to fully exploit the power of pop as a jamming phenomenon. The narrator, calling himself a would-be, acknowledges through his strangely tensed construction that he is not, nor will he ever be, the real deal. Nevertheless, there's nothing he wouldn't take, even intravenous, to fully inhabit the role, believing so faithfully that he admitted to Mark Fisher in 2011 that pop music was on the other side of the stuff that accorded with the unsettling of truth and the decentering of the subject, and all the binary oppositions that Derrida talked about overturning. G's aphoristic scribblings are tea leaves portending 21st century poptimism. When he writes that in pop music we are dealing with a history of production that has made the improper proper, he could have been describing C's rise to the mainstream. When he describes the semiotic function as pop as a code which no one can explain, but everyone understands, he anticipates arguments contra Adorno about pop music's populist appeal as its source of political usefulness. The realities of life as a pop star, however, transformed G from a theory-addled pop optimist into a victim of, in his own words, brain damage from pop. G stopped writing in his notebook and thinking about theory in the mid-1980s, right as SP began to top American and British charts. He made one more pop record, 1988's Provision, threw out his continental philosophy and retreated to Wales, where he spent the next decade thinking about epistemology and listening to rap. Against A. If Mr. B was a longtime student of The Voice and its double, its filtration and reproduction, he was also a voice against oppression. Again, a theoretical politics should not be overlooked in the implications of letting the other speak. Sadly, B's own optimism may have been crushed by systems that monopolize the vote and the voice, yet we would be remiss in omitting attention of B's profound disgust with racism. The telephonic connection was always meant to cross so-called racial lines. In the constellation mapped by our reading, it foreshadows the philosophic satellite that Derrida has launched against apartheid. Blindly connecting, blind in the sense of justice, technosophical poetics stem in part from an anti-racist bent. Derrida calls racism's obsessionality to the obsessional terror which, above all, forbids contact. B writes of an exchange echoed on board a ship bound for America in 1892. A young shipboard acquaintance in the smoking room talked in rather an insulting and sneering way of the nigger in the South. I replied that I thought that the Negroes were entitled to equal rights to himself. It looked at first as if there might be some sharp words. The other gentleman, however, so promptly sided with me that Mr. K very wisely allowed the subject to drop and devoted himself to making himself agreeable. Club 2. F is one of Vienna's first clubs and a nightlife legend ever since. She hasn't lost any of her badass attitude or taste for the party. After 20 years, the event venue underground party location still delivers the goods, attracting international music acts and producing severe memory lapses. And it still looks like the dark insides of a cocaine addict's nostril. Music. The FC plays ambient electronic music that gets you in the mood for more, and sometimes features live concerts on their small stage. Inside the F, you'll experience all kinds of electronic music blasted on the sound system, once rumored to be Europe's best. It's most famous for hosting small concerts from rap, indie rock, hip-hop, and all other kinds of music that will make you want to jump around a lot and get really sweaty. What kind of night will you have? Their outdoor sea of black chewing gum-riddled bench seats and tables is the site of V, pre-game drinks, for many. That is, until the time comes for F to swallow them whole into one of its sweaty parties inside. It's not uncommon to find yourself spat out at 6 a.m., walking home, watching the sunrise after an evening at the F. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention.
I guess now if anyone has any question, but at least like it's really nice if we can open the discussion, because we show a lot of material.
Yeah.
We might have overwhelmed you. Yeah.
Sorry, the live stream, we don't have a mic for the audience today, so if you could just try to repeat the question.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Thank you.
Okay. I'll make it simple. Could you just say a few words about the shape of the book? Because I can see the paper, it's totally neon yellow.
Yes.
It's also some black pages that
Yeah.
that divides it. So just a few words about the shape, please.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of my conception, this was something that was kind of done in relationship and collaboration with the publishers. I think one of the things that we were interested in was approximating kind of what a pocket guide to a city might look and feel like. In terms of, the interposed pages, we were thinking about them, I think, as kind of like ways of referencing the video and its orientation and aspect ratio as kind of like detours in the text. And also that kind of sparked the idea of doing the stickers
Yeah.
that, are also sort of related to the content within, kind of like plays on the contents and the forms of the other material related to it. It's almost like, when we were thinking about like size and format, it just didn't seem right to have it be, I don't know, a standard A4 size or, it just seemed there was something about the ability maybe to put this in one's pocket and carry it around as though it might be a guide to a place in time, even though it isn't. Sort of mimicry of common or generic form, but differential content.
The yellow is
the yellow,
a very specific yellow, because it's factory yellow, like factory records, and he wanted somehow also like to reference an extreme, direct, and recognizable graphic style that was applied into like club nights as like clubbing communication comes into play quite strongly within the work itself. So when we found a paper called Factory Yellow, we were like, okay, well, we have no choice. We need to take it.
And then, of course, the lettering has to be black because...
Exactly. And as well, like, it was extremely interesting because when speaking with Tony, I was like, we were like with the publishers, do you want any stylistic diversity? Do you want to divide the paragraph? And it was extremely clear on how he was interested in like creating the most direct and simple layout in order to allow the information to mesh into each other and to be like completely, like the sampling to be smoothless, I would say. So it's something that by working with him, I learned through this like process of being like, okay, it wants Helvetica because it's an extremely simple, like not stylized font, and it wants a character that is recognizable, no bold letters, no paragraph. As how do you create a unique piece that flows, even though there's a lot of different information coming into play.
I have a question that relates maybe more to the exhibition, but also maybe the book. I was wondering about your relationship to activism, because like first seeing the videos, one of the qualities I think is also that I felt directly addressed. So basically, seeing the videos, it puts me in a place to think about something. It really addresses me directly as a viewer or spectator of something happening or unfolding. So it's like getting a question asked directly. And that's maybe the connection to the guide. It's also like a travel guide is meant to
Bring you
make somebody move in the city or
Right.
towards something. And in a way, I always thought there is a connection to activism, because with a certain intention of making me think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you also address activism occasionally in
Right.
text directly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is something that I think about, like how work can allow for conditions of possibility of thinking first and maybe acting in the world, as opposed to kind of detachment per se. Even though, you know, a lot of my material is sourced from outside of me, there is a kind of always an implication of a kind of communication and a type of directness that I hope to foreground in the pieces, is, you know, kind of constructed as they are. They also do manifest like voices and effects of those kinds of, you know, modes of address. I mean, I think it's obvious, you know, something that's not unique to me or my practice. I guess I've always been attracted to work that calls a kind of spectator into existence or into potential conversation. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the idea that politics, society, ideas about the state of the world or the local, you know, community in which one exists are kind of important registers of information to try to circulate. And so I guess this is my kind of take on those relations. It's sort of like it wouldn't be enough. And this is kind of maybe my response to maybe my training and my interest in like language and existing texts as material, that I'm kind of interested in those things maybe on a kind of formal and generic or taxonomic level, but I'm also interested in transmitting information, you know, that might be useful at a particular place in time. And is it possible to do those things, those two things simultaneously, I guess, is the question that animates what I do and how I approach it. Yeah.
You talked about translating your material through one format to another, and I was just curious to hear your approach to translation to other languages.
It's something that I have done on occasion, and something that I think I would like to do more, even though there are sort of problems and tensions with doing that. I do sort of, you know, I'm relatively monolinguistic, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are not. And so I think, especially in terms of contexts and potential readings for work, I think it's something I probably will do more often. I mean, I have done some works that were kind of, because of their context, kind of meant to be translated or intended to be translated. But I have thought about what it would be like to maybe do an exhibition of a series of works that are all translations of one kind or another. And that might become a kind of both a theme and a content for work. I've even on occasion had the idea of doing things that are translated into a different language than the context in which the work is seen, like bracketing English out for a particular presentation, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Sorry, I'm not sure if this is very artistic thing, but I have the feeling that you have like an activist in you that is using the same tools and the same language that is used nowadays with this quick processing, bite-size information, rapidly consumable in a way. So which is something you criticize, right? So there's like this satirical aspect. You have like the urgency, I read that, the urgency on the yellow color, the way you have the whole pack on the different medium. This is like very typical
Right.
propaganda and branding management. So there's here like the usage of the same language in a different context to the opposite effect. So it's like somehow subversive thing. Do you agree with this? Is it intentional when you plan these? For instance, the function of the guide,
Yeah.
the quick shortness of the clips, the simple colors.
I mean, I hope on some level that it is both attractive and perceivable, that there are limits to it. Yeah. So that it's my relationship to those forms and formats is complicated in some ways. I don't know whether they are fully satisfactory, for the things that they hope to represent. And I hope that maybe viewers and readers, have some suspicion, or that there are certain slippages that happen as people experience the work. I mean, I don't pretend that these things are fully comprehensive or totalizing in any way.
They're stimulating,
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like
And sometimes people say, do I need to get all the references? And in a way, that might be impossible. But the idea that, it's like, it seems like an imperative. And it's like, why is that? Yeah. Or, I feel as though I should know everything I need to know for one pass of the material. But I hope that I've, build things both simply in terms of formal decisions, but also layered in terms of material to respond to, that there's kind of a play, or, yeah. And maybe something that, I don't know, rewards or produces maybe different impressions and implications when you see it again. Yeah.
Another question. In your process, do you see history or previous studies or history as a genre or as a science?
Oh, gosh. I mean,
Because you're kind of a historian yourself. There's a part in it which is kind of a research, an active research on the current culture and the reflection on it, right?
in a way, yeah.
So it's like the present culture, the contemporary setup. It's like I don't know about the question myself, but it's like this relationship history. Is it more like your base? Do you question?
I would maybe take a couple of different tacks, and let me see if I can hold up long enough to get to both of them. I mean, I think history is an interesting phenomenon because I think history can be encoded, and maybe always is encoded from a particular place, particular circumstances, and might take a variety of forms. Like, for instance, I think there are ways in which popular music encodes history and circulates it, but it's not the same way as a kind of text that claims authority as history might circulate, right? And I think it's also possible for people who are positioned or trying to think through language and genre to produce what one might consider to be historical documents from fragments or unresolved parts of official history. So, yeah, I mean, people, for instance, this is kind of not directly related, but people have sometimes, said, why take up these, kind of topics and forms? And it's like, well, doesn't this material already, exist in, historical text or sociological text or whatever? And it's sort of like, yes, but this is, a kind of different context and a maybe way of unsettling or complicating, questions of what counts as knowledge or what counts as authoritative. Yeah.
What becomes history?
Yeah. whose history, yeah. And yeah.
I'm curious about the use of the music, because you start off with this political issue in terms of parents and children and them being separated, which is obviously a very intense and important issue, and I had a strong emotional reaction to that. And then the music I found to be like an anesthetic. Like it made me very relaxed, and I could almost feel that being in the cave and at the rave and dancing and being anesthetized by the music and by that place where we've probably all been at some point in our lives. So the anesthetic in contrast to this really important critical issue. So I'm wondering if you were somehow using the music to reflect on how we are sometimes anesthetized, but also trying to say something about the nature of us as humans, in that we have such an intense desire for pleasure and to be anesthetized that we sometimes don't see all the things that are right in front of us and have a lack of desire to actually do anything about it. So I wondered if that was intentional, or if that was just my experience in this moment, or if you could say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think those relations are complicated. I think that one thing that one might say is that these things are kind of in parallel with one another. And I don't want to suggest that the rave is a kind of panacea or solution for these problematics at all. But I do think that there might be models for being able to process difference and to live differently and to maybe think about where one is in the world in relationship to those practices. If you think maybe about the historical conditions and processes that they themselves kind of reflect and reproduce, they're not the same thing, you know, but they do exist in the same world and might communicate with one another. You know, in that kind of, I don't know whether it's possible to kind of isolate them as readily as we kind of imagine, you know, a hedonistic experience outside of a social context. It's like contexts are always social. And in a certain way, it might be interesting to think about the club as a model for processing difference and processing conflict. You know, it can be anesthetic, but it could also disclose possibilities that we wouldn't normally, you know, think about. And you know, it's kind of like, what does it mean for people to come together for maybe a variety of purposes, but occupy the same space in particular ways that may not happen, you know, kind of on the street in daily life. I don't know whether there's, you know, kind of direct, what's the word, instrumental relation, you know, that one could describe. But I like to keep it as a potential and as a kind of model for thinking, if nothing else. But I do think that, you know, what we think does to some extent inform the way we act in the world. So. Steinar.
I was just wondering about the text that you just read. It was really interesting listening to your reading and how I'm assuming there was a variation of different sources.
Yeah.
But how it kind of seamlessly flowed into each other while hearing you reading it. And maybe also because sort of characters referred to were anonymized by using.
Yeah, and there's some recurrence of the anonymizing function, yeah.
But so of course I was curious to hear more about the sources, but maybe you could just say a little bit about how you worked with that particular text.
Yeah, describing that process. It was interesting. I think because there was a kind of primary text that I had access to. And it was like, it was interesting to sort of think about this project as a way of contextualizing some work that I had already done. And I guess this goes back to, you know, your question about working process. I mean, for this one, this was like something that I would not necessarily have imagined doing myself. And the kind of, the sort of remit. And it was sort of like, well, how might I use this, you know, or think about this, you know, because it's like, would I, you know, write a city guide or something like it to a place that I haven't really been, or how would I approach that, you know, sort of problem? And so sometimes my first impulse is to look in my archive, you know, to say, well, is there something in here that could act as, you know, a kind of place to start? And so I found a text that I was familiar with, and sort of like, okay, you can start here, and then what other materials might generically frame that? And so it was kind of a back and forth, you know. Then I went to, you know, internet sources, or I sometimes like concrete and specific, like almost the case study is a place that I often start. So I said, oh yes, the last time I went to Vienna, I had 3 books, and one of the books I used more than others. So it might be interesting to use, you know, aspects of that. And I kind of, you know, read the book again, and I said, okay, again, like what category of material? And I decided to take the history, you know, in that case. And I said, okay, it's, you know, obviously places, histories, their associations. But I didn't take specific places. I sort of decided that, oh yeah, there was an article kind of introducing you to Vienna's club culture, and I would take those as the specific places, whereas, you know, kind of the generalized history or framing device from, you know, a guide that was, you know, quote unquote out of date was kind of performed that function. And so it was almost like mimicking, you know, things that you would find in a guidebook, except displacing their sources as a, you know, kind of process and procedure. I mean, in some ways, it's like the way I might work through a group of texts around a theme, but the vocabulary and the specifics were kind of different, because I would never. It's like, and the idea too of like writing a text that has a function other than what my normative context for writing would be. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, this is meant to be a kind of maybe trigger to others or framing device for an exhibition, which was kind of fascinating, you know, to me, just as a kind of way of approaching a project, because usually it's like I mean, it's almost like a reversal or a kind of displacement of a normative activity. It's like, yeah, I write about my work from time to time. I kind of have mixed feelings about it. But the idea of like developing something that will be read in a context other than normative is something that appealed to me. And so, yeah.
It's always occurred to me that the way of using letters and fonts is like this it's grotesque, you know, the stylish is called grotesque, is like very objective, black on white or white on black. I mean, it's a way of, in a way it's very non-emotional. But still, it's kind of stylish.
Yeah.
Because you repeat it as sort of aesthetic element in many of the films, especially the Attilia series. So, could you just say a little bit about why you stick to this kind of form when it comes to the written text?
Yeah.
And how it's
Yeah, it's for me. I guess there's a part of me that has a little bit of a quibble with that kind of implication of a kind of absolute, objectivity. I don't. I've thought about this, a lot over the kind of like process of works, and maybe with the Evil series specifically. It's like I'm not a designer by training, and so I don't want people to kind of be seduced into a kind of symbolic realm of like, well, he's using this typeface this time. It's sort of like, well, maybe it's maybe more again about a mode of address than it is about style as such. I kind of like generic things, maybe because so often the default has certain associations and assumptions built into it, like objectivity, for instance. And sometimes I, will choose a serif font to kind of recapitulate maybe in some small way that this might have come from a newspaper source, for instance. But it's not like highly wrought like each decision, because I actually want to produce certain effects. And it's not like I'm not attentive, but I'm not kind of focused on that. So I don't know, there are times when I do think, well, maybe more variation, would be helpful. But I also, there is something about at least the implication of something being direct, and maybe that upon reading, and I mean that in both in terms of understanding and in terms of the presentation, not as clear as it at first appears. Yeah, it's kind of like, I think it may have something to do too with at least the idea that I had going into the Evil series. It's like I was at pains to recall for myself that these are texts that had already had readings. Most of them, were published. And I had this feeling that they had been more or less poorly read. So it wasn't like a question of unearthing a secret or something that was unknown. It was more about recontextualizing something that people claim to know. And so that kind of maybe repetition, recontextualization was more important than style, right? It's almost like this is stuff that, comes from newspapers, magazines, and sometimes, theoretical texts or interviews. But they're also about things that are not, quote unquote, secret, that they're kind of just a, reorientation of things that are allegedly known. So maybe that informs, kind of like not too fancy, but shift the scale, for instance, or the speed of the reading or some other attribute.
I think it's very effective. That's why I just wanted to say something about it, because after a certain amount of repetitions, you also kind of lose your attention on the style or whatever you call it, and the content get more visible. I hope. I think so. So that's why I actually like that you repeat yourself.
Yeah. I mean, too, again, it's that question around the duration, or the exhaustiveness of it. It's like maybe that feeling that, oh no, it's not over, it's not over yet. Yeah.
Okay, that's the last question. Just wanted to say thank you, both Attilia and Tony. Wonderful talk and presentation, and for being able to see a part of this brand new work as well. Thank you all for coming, and reminding everyone that it's just one day left of the exhibition tomorrow. So if some of you haven't seen, I really encourage everyone to see the whole thing in full as well. It's really worth taking the time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.